Tuesday, and we're going to continue to review. Now, not everything that is going to be discussed in this lecture will be on the exam. I will try and remember what stuff in this lecture is going to be on your exam, but the reason why I wanted to do this lecture is because a lot of this stuff that we're going to be talking about today will be the foundation for what you're going to understand throughout the rest of this semester. Does that make sense? This is absolutely vital to your understanding, right? Not for this exam, but for your general over understanding of this course. Yes?
But everything from Tuesday will be on the exam.
Most of what was on Tuesday, most, not all, most of what was on Tuesday will be on the exam. Yes? Any other questions? I will try and highlight the stuff that's going to be on this exam if I remember, but I'm old. I keep saying this over, and I'm 65, so it's really hard when you're 65 to remember this crap. I know, right? It's unbelievable. I know, 65. It's unbelievable. I'm almost close to retirement age. Asian don't raisin. For real, for real. Not even joking about that. All right, so let's talk about. We're not talking about this. We're going to move on to the lecture. This is not up for discussion. We're going to continue with the lecture. Okay. So we talked a lot about ligand-gated ion channels last time, right? So a neurotransmitter binds to its receptor and it opens up an ion channel. You guys remember this? Vaguely? Right? Okay, no, this you have to understand if you want to understand the rest of the course. Right? So we have these ligand-gated ion channels, and they are generally closed when there's no neurotransmitter bound to its receptor. Okay? Right? However, this ion channel experiences some type of conformational change when a neurotransmitter binds to it, and then it'll open up to different ions. Now, these ligand-gated ion channels are less selective than the voltage-gated ion channels we talked about. Do you guys remember the voltage-gated ion channels, right? They only open up to sodium, potassium, chloride, etc., right? But these ligand-gated ion channels actually are less selective for ions. So, if, for example, you have a ligand-gated ion channel and the neurotransmitter binds to it, it opens, that means it'll let potassium and sodium in. Okay, it's not specific to any particular ion. Okay. Now, acetylcholine, that's what this ACH stands for, and glutamate. Do we remember what glutamate is? It's excitatory. Who said that? God bless you. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Right, it is excitatory. So glutamate is excitatory. It causes an, what is this? What is this? That's right. It causes an EPSP, right? Acetylcholine also causes an EPSP when it binds to a specific type of receptor, okay? Glycine and GABA, these are the ligand-gated ion channels that produce an IPSP. What is an IPSP?
Inhibitory postsynaptic potential.
Yes, a little bit slower on that one. Yes, inhibitory postsynaptic potential, right? So glycine and GABA produce IPSPs, acetylcholine and glutamate produce EPSPs, right? And we mentioned this last time, it's chloride that produces that IPSP, right? Why does chloride produce an IPSP? Yes, exactly. It is negatively charged because it has that negative, because it's a negatively charged ion. Unlike sodium, which is what?
Positive.
Positive. Thank you. Now, the one thing you will need to know for the exam, okay, because I remember this, I don't know how, it's amazing. 65, it's amazing. It is faster than a G protein coupled receptor. Its actions are much, much faster than a G protein coupled receptor. It is amazing.
Can you say gene what?
G protein coupled receptor, that's what GPCR stands for. I got lazy. So it's GPCR, okay? But these ligand-gated ion channels operate at a much faster rate than a G protein coupled receptor, and you will see why in a minute. Okay? But just know that kinetically speaking, these ligand-gated ion channels are much faster than a G protein coupled receptor. Understood? Great. All right, let's move on to the amino acid gated channels. This won't be on your exam. But I wanted to go over this as an example of how these ligand-gated ion channels work. Now I call it amino acid, but what do I mean by amino acid?
Neurotransmitter?
Yes. What types of neurotransmitters are amino acids?
No, amino acids are their own category, right?
Yes. So which two are part of that category?
GABA.
GABA and glutamate. Dopamine is a catecholamine or a monoamine. It's both, right? But these amino acid gated channels that I'm referring to are glutamate and GABA. Okay. Now, these amino acid gated channels mediate most of the fast synaptic transmission. I said this earlier, right? I said that the ligand gated ion channels operate much faster, right, than the G protein coupled receptors. So anything that requires a fast onset of action is going to be mediated by an amino acid gated channel, otherwise known as a ligand gated ion channel. Does that make sense?
So those are the same.
They're basically the same thing, yes. Okay. So you have glutamate gated channels, right? We know what glutamate is, we know it's excitatory. And there are there's three different types of ligand gated ion receptors. Okay, so this is an AMPA receptor. So these three are receptors for glutamate. Yes.
You might have gone over this, but when it says glutamate gated, it means that's the neurotransmitter that needs to be present or linked for the gato.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's what happens. That's the neurotransmitter that has to bind to the receptor in order for that ion channel to open. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Great. So there are three different receptors for these glutamate gated ion channels: AMPA, NMDA, kinase. For now, because we're probably all in a panic about the exam, I'm not going to ask you to know how these different things work, because I think at some point we'll probably talk about it anyway. I usually like to talk about it early in the semester, but we don't have time for that. So just know that glutamate in general is a very fast-acting ion channel, ligand-gated ion channel, and it's because it's permeable to ions. You don't have to remember which ones, okay? But that's how it works. It's fast because it's permeable to these ions, and we won't go over it. Kinase, NMDA is another one. We're going to talk about NMDA a lot in this class. Just remember that NMDA is a glutamate receptor. And this is just for the rest of the class. Just remember, NMDA is a glutamate receptor. AMPA is a glutamate receptor. We don't need to know anything about kinase because, as you can see here, not much is known about kinase. So if I don't have to know it, you don't have to either. Okay? But suffice it to say, we're going to talk a lot about AMPA and NMDA ad nauseum till you want to throw up. Ad nauseum meaning you're going to throw up. That's not what that means. Okay. All right? GABA. This is also, the only thing you need to know about GABA is that it is inhibitory, okay, for the exam. But for the rest of this course, what I want you to know is that GABA, and I already mentioned this earlier, causes chloride to go in through its ion channel, right, once GABA binds to its receptor. And there are several different GABA receptors, right? But in general, you have GABA-gated ion channels. And we're going to go over this information later when we talk about psychopharmacology. So you don't need to know the information on this slide, except to say that GABA is inhibitory and it allows chloride to go in. Got that? GABA is inhibitory, it allows chloride to go in. That's it. We're going to talk about all this other stuff later when we talk about anxiety. Okay? Does that make sense? We won't do it now. All right. So let's talk about the slower receptors, okay? So we talked about the ligand-gated ion channels, and they are faster than the G protein coupled receptors, right? The GPCRs. Now, why are G protein coupled receptors slower? Why are they slower?
They have a longer process.
Yes, many more steps to take. They have many more steps to take. And then you think, well, why is this important? Why would we need something like a G protein coupled receptor? Well, we'll get to that in a minute because there are very specific reasons why G protein coupled receptors are great for our central nervous system. Okay, but generally speaking, they're also called metabotropic receptors. So if you see something that says it's a metabotropic receptor, that also means that it's a G protein coupled receptor. Okay. And the only thing I want you to take away from this slide is that they have longer lasting effects than the ligand-gated receptors. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide, because this next slide will actually tell you in great detail how G protein coupled receptors work. Okay. So I'm gonna walk you through this figure, because I think this figure tells you, generally speaking, how G protein coupled receptors work. This is also in your bear book in chapter 6, okay? Now, all G protein coupled receptors have a G protein, and they all basically look just like that. So this is your G protein coupled receptor. Now, mind you, a G protein coupled receptor could bind something like acetylcholine. It could bind dopamine. It could bind serotonin, right? So a whole bunch of different neurotransmitters have G protein coupled receptors, but they're specific for that one neurotransmitter, right? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So you have this receptor that's specific to one type of neurotransmitter. When that one neurotransmitter binds to this G protein coupled receptor, it activates this G protein, which is basically just hanging out in the membrane. Okay? So this G protein is hanging out in the membrane, and what happens is that, do you see this guanosine diphosphate here, this GDP? How many of you are familiar with biochemistry? GDP. It's not like the gross national product, or it has nothing to do with economics, right? GDP is guanosine diphosphate. Okay. What happens when that neurotransmitter binds to this receptor is it causes the GDP to get kicked off, and it gets replaced by a guanosine triphosphate. So a guanosine with 3 phosphate groups.
And it's only when it binds to it, when it kicks it off?
It kicks off this GDP, and this GTP gets attached to this alpha subunit, and this causes this to get activated. It activates this G protein, okay? Now, this activation here causes the subunits of the G protein to break apart. And what's really cool is that each one of these subunits for that G protein can then exert effects elsewhere. All right? It doesn't just have the one effect. For example, this alpha subunit could affect an enzyme. This beta subunit, this beta gamma subunit could affect another protein, right? Which is really cool, because what does this fundamentally mean about the G proteins? Like, conceptually, what does this mean in terms of the G protein coupled receptors?
It triggers 2 reactions
At once, which is really cool. So even though it is not as fast as a ligand-gated ion channel, it still has more widespread effects. Does that make sense? Because it can take each one of its subunits and exert effects over here on one protein, and then over here on another protein.
So,
Yes.
and I was gonna say, I mean, if we're trying to fire an action potential down the axon, I guess we'll use the ligand gated for those. But is this used in a different part of the brain then, or is this if it's slower? But
So when you the first part of what you said, the action potential
mm-hmm.
triggers ligand-gated ion
Yeah.
channels.
Mm.
No,
Okay.
it depends on the neuron.
Okay, it depends on the neuron.
Yeah, it depends on the neurons. You have a serotonin neuron, you have a dopamine neuron, you have
Okay.
a glutamate GABA neuron, right? And so if your action potential is propagating down the length of a glutamate ion, it releases what? Let's try this again. When glutamate when the action potential goes down a glutamate axon, what does it release?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, let's try this again. What does it release? With feeling. Okay, so if you have a glutamate neuron, what neurotransmitter does it release? Glutamate. Because the action potential causes glutamate to get released, right? But this does not mean that it's only specific to glutamate. It depends on the neuron that receives the chemical signal, right?
Okay.
So when we talk about the action potential, it's really the voltage-gated ion channels, not the ligand-gated.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
That's both. It's both.
All right.
Right, because the ligand-gated has to receive that neurotransmitter from the other neuron,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the voltage-gated ion channels that ultimately contribute to the action potential.
Okay, I got it.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Make sense to one person?
Yes.
Only the one person? Yes.
Good enough.
That's good enough.
Thank you.
That'll
for
be the one
clearing that
person that gets that
As
answer
long
right.
as I teach one of you, I'm technically a teacher.
There you go. All right, so, but what's cool about these G protein coupled receptors is that it has widespread effects. Now, I don't need you to memorize this table. Cross it out if you want to. If it makes you feel better, go ahead and cross that table out. You feel pretty good about that, right? Let's cross it out. Put a big fat X in there, right? Now, what I want you to remember, though, is that beyond glutamate, GABA, and glycine, and acetylcholine, I should say, most of the other neurotransmitters have some G protein coupled receptors. So G protein coupled receptors are everywhere in the brain. Even though it's an inefficient way to signal, it is still the most popular way to signal in the brain. Right? It's like your Taylor Swift of receptors in your brain. I don't know. She seems popular. She's still popular? Mm-hmm. No? Oh, is she on the outs? Damn it, I try and keep up with pop culture and I'm still behind. That's okay. This is the class where I said Tigger, right?
Yeah.
I feel really good about that decision. I took that home to my husband. He laughed for about 5 minutes. Like crying tears. He's like, you thought it was Tigger? And I was like, what? That was a really cute play on words. No. All right, so G protein coupled receptors for all of these different neurotransmitters. Now you see serotonin. There are 12 different G protein coupled receptors for serotonin alone. And once again, what I want you to remember is that when this neurotransmitter binds to a specific receptor, it has different effects than if it were to bind to a different one of its G protein coupled receptors, right? So, as an example, if acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor, it produces a very different effect than if it were to bind to a nicotinic receptor. Okay? And we'll talk about the differences between those two. But this is just a fundamental principle that I want you to understand. I'm seeing a lot of depressed faces here. I'm not asking you to memorize that, okay, what the different effects of these receptors are. What I want you to remember is that each receptor has its own different effect, even though the same neurotransmitter binds to it. That's the concept that I want you to understand. Is that understandable? Mm-hmm. That even if it's the same neurotransmitter, it can have different effects depending on the receptor it binds to. That makes sense, yes? Okay, good. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted. I feel like that's hopefully pretty straightforward. Okay? You don't need to memorize this process, but I want you to know that G protein coupled receptors have widespread effects. Okay? And this is the process that I just talked to you about. This is what it is, just outlined in a verbal way. This is also in your book, figure 6.24, right? You can read this on your own time, but this is the exact process that I just told you about. Okay, and you can read that later. But this is another figure that I wanted to show you because I think this really tells you how powerful G protein coupled receptors are versus a ligand-gated ion channel. Okay, this is a really great illustration because what's cool about these G protein coupled receptors is that once again you have a neurotransmitter. It binds to one receptor, and then what's cool is that this one receptor might activate several different G proteins, right? So you see here in this diagram, it's activating 3 different G proteins, and that's really cool. But what does this in effect mean? It means that it actually has this cascading effect, so that not only are you affecting all of these different G proteins, but these G proteins in turn are affecting enzymes, and then these enzymes are further amplifying the signal from this one binding of this one neurotransmitter to one receptor. So in essence, what's happening is that you're getting a signal amplification. It's not a one-to-one thing. It's like a 1 to 10,000 different thing. Right? That's what you're getting more bang for your buck when you have a neurotransmitter that binds to its receptor if it's a G protein coupled receptor. Because you're getting a constellation of effects. And that is the end of the story. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And this is very, very good to know because a lot of this stuff underlies basic processes in the brain like learning and memory, drug addiction, emotion, depression. All of these things are altered by differences in G protein coupled receptor signaling pathways. Does that make sense? Okay. These G protein coupled receptors are very, very important. And like I said, a lot of these processes underlie learning and memory. And we will talk about that. Okay? A lot of fear. I feel a lot of tension. Is there a little bit of tension? No? We feel good about this? Anyone want to give me a hug? No? Oh,
Yeah, sure.
It's daunting to know that you know so little, like us. It's at least for me, it's daunting.
Yeah.
It's just, it feels like you're getting like a little piece, and like we're I don't know. I feel like I'm missing puzzle pieces.
Yeah. Anyone else feel like they're missing puzzle pieces? Yeah. Yeah. I understand that. So, and this is the challenging part every time I teach this class is trying to get, and I'm glad you articulated that because I need to know this. If you don't tell me, then I assume that you understand, right? But it's really important for me to know what you don't understand because then I can go back and explain it, okay? But the G protein coupled receptors are different than the ligand-gated. We understand what ligand-gated ion channels are. That's very easy to understand, right? Neurotransmitter binds to its receptor, causes an ion channel to open, causes the membrane to depolarize because you're getting more ions in. That's pretty simple, right? If it's glutamate. This is far more complicated because you have multiple things at work, right? But I think what I'm trying to get you to understand is that this one neurotransmitter binds to one receptor and then causes a whole bunch of effects. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I don't care if you know about any of this other crap. The only thing I want you to remember is that you get more bang for your buck, that one neurotransmitter binds to one receptor, and then you get a whole bunch of other really cool stuff that happens. Okay? I know that sounds really vague. Would it help if I went over a specific example?
Yes.
What is the butterfly effect?
You know, like the butterfly changes everything else, like
For domino
like
effects?
the wind.
That's an Ashton Kutcher movie, right?
Is
that not who you say his name?
Kutcher.
Kutcher?
Kutcher.
Is it
Not
Kutcher?
Kutcher.
Whatever. Ashton Kutcher.
It rhymes with butcher.
I don't really like Ashton. I don't know, whatever. So, I am.
One thing that he changed from the past that changed everything else.
Is that how you're comparing the G protein coupled receptor?
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's a really, no, I'm not even joking. That is a really fantastic analogy. Yes.
So, I'm gonna maybe find what I am kind of understanding as an example. So, GPCR, so serotonin uses GPCR. So, could you also think that because multiple things happen because of the G protein receptors, that's why disorders that involve serotonin are multiple faceted? And that's kind of what's going on because it's doing multiple things at once with it, and that's why if there's any imbalance in it, that's why it's kind of like.
But that's another reason why like disorders are so complicated too, right? Yeah. Because you have all of these different enzymes and proteins that might ultimately be impacted, right? So with the ligand-gated ion channels, you're not. I mean, you are to a certain extent affecting certain proteins, but with the G protein coupled receptors, you are directly affecting these proteins. And what do I mean by proteins? I'm talking about enzymes. And these enzymes, what do enzymes do?
They facilitate chemical reactions.
Yes, they catalyze reactions. So when you get an enzyme that increases their activity, that means you're producing more of a protein, or you're stopping the activity of a protein, right? This is all about proteins.
And these are found on the postsynaptic. This is where the neurotransmitter binds.
Yeah.
Right after it's
Yeah,
formed.
postsynaptic.
Like really easy to press.
I mean, there are autoreceptors, so those are presynaptic, right? But let's just focus on the post. Yes.
So for this picture and for the G protein coupled receptors only, you want us to know that this receptor just has a cascading effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Widespread effects.
Complicating it for ourselves.
Widespread. Don't hurt yourselves.
Yeah.
I'm telling you exactly what you need to know. G protein coupled receptors take longer to take effect, and they affect multiple proteins. That's it. Don't hurt yourselves anymore. I don't know all the G protein coupled receptor cascading signaling crap thingies, whatever. I mean, I'm not a biochemist, so I don't actually know those things, right? But what I do know is that they take a much longer time to take effect than the ligand-gated ion channels. But do you understand why?
Yes.
Yes. Does that help? You can say no if you want.
It helps.
It helps. Okay. You guys want to give each other a hug? I'm all about hugging. I like hugging. Damn it!
Me too.
Why do I keep doing that? Okay. All right. So does this make sense? neuroreceptors. Every time I show an image of this to an undergrad class, people innately, I feel the tension and the shoulders tensing up, and I feel like you guys are just sitting there going, oh my God, do I have to remember that? No! I would never ask you to remember that. I just want you to understand that these are really cool receptors, that they actually do have a very important function in your central nervous system, okay? It is so much easier to talk about the ligand-gated ion channels. Okay. Now, let's move on to neurotransmitters. And I only want you to be aware of these neurotransmitters. You don't have to know any of them for the exam. The only thing you have to know is that GABA and glutamate are inhibitory and excitatory, and you have to know your monoamines. Got it? Know which ones those are. Know which ones the monoamines are. Can anyone tell me what your monoamines are?
Serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine.
Yeah, that's this slide. Okay? So you have dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Okay, these are your monoamines. Collectively, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and serotonin are your catecholamines. No, I think I got that wrong. It might be the other way around. I'm having a brain fart. Does anyone remember?
You said on Tuesday that serotonin was part of the catecholamines.
That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
I said it the other way though, right?
No, you said it right.
I did. I just said it right. Oh, thank you. Okay. I was losing track of what I was saying, which happens sometimes when
But
you're
serotonin is
65.
monoamine, right?
Can someone else re-say it?
Okay, well, for my Tuesday notes, you said that serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine were the catecholamines.
Yes. Yes. And these three are the monoamines.
Okay.
Dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine.
But serotonin is not a monoamine.
No, it's not a monoamine. It's a catecholamine. You don't need to know that. Just know that these are your monoamines. Dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine.
So those aren't catecholamines?
They are also catecholamines. Serotonin is not a monoamine.
Okay,
That's what I meant to say.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, I don't want you to memorize any of this. Put an X through it if it makes you feel better. This is just an example to show you that acetylcholine isn't everywhere in your brain. It's not. It's not everywhere. It's produced in the medial septal nucleus and the basal nucleus of the main nerve. You don't need to know that. It's produced in a very specific location, but then it gets shunted to all of these different parts of the brain. And that's true of all of your neurotransmitters. All your neurotransmitters are made in a specific part of the brain, and then they get shunted out to different parts of the brain. Okay? Does that make sense? That's it. Okay? So that's true for acetylcholine. That's true for dopamine. So dopamine gets produced in the midbrain. Actually, most neurotransmitters are produced in the midbrain, and then they get shunted out to different parts of the brain that need them. That's all I want you to remember. Is that clear? And it's not for the exam. This is a basic principle that I want you to understand for the rest of this course. Right? The neurotransmitters are made in a specific location, and then they get shuttled out to different parts of the brain. Okay? Are we okay with that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool. Okay. Same thing with serotonin. And look, 13 receptor subtypes. Isn't that crazy? There's so many. And we don't care about any of them. I'm kidding. We care about some of them. But look how widespread serotonin is, right? If you look at dopamine, right, it's not that widespread, right? But then when you look at something like serotonin, you're like, holy crap, serotonin goes everywhere, right? That's pretty amazing. All right, but that's all I want you to remember, is that it's made in a specific location, and then it gets shuttled out to other parts of your brain. That's it. Okay? Moving on. Let's talk about your nerves. And I feel like I gave you a video about neuroanatomy, correct? Mm-hmm. Was it the one with that cool lady who was sitting there cutting brains?
Slicing it like a turkey.
I know! Wasn't it cool?
Yeah.
I love that. I thought it was an awesome video, and she does a really fantastic job explaining everything. Totally weird. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this because I think this is also pretty important. I don't know if I have time to go back to this, but I think it's important because you have nerves that are coming out from your brain, and these nerves are called your cranial nerves. Now, does anyone know like the thing that people say to remember all the cranial nerves?
On Old Olympus towering top, Finn and German Buttes and Hops.
Yeah.
That one.
Yep. And that gives you the order of the cranial nerves, right, 1 through 12. And then hopefully, on Old Olympus towering top, Finn and German Buttes and Hops.
Do you want us to be able to identify them from an image like that?
No.
Okay. So we
Why
don't
would
have
I
to know which
ever
one
make
to
you
do
do that?
Sensory motor.
Maybe if I hated you, I would make
I
you do
was
that.
just wondering.
On the test, we had us learn the sensory, motor, and both.
Yeah.
On the read, do we have to know their specific function though?
I mean, it should just be inherent in what they're called, right? I'll talk about it. But no, you don't need to know the different cranial nerves. Just know that there are 2 different types of nerves. You have your cranial nerves, which emanate from your brain, and then you have peripheral spinal nerves. These are peripheral spinal nerves, and we're going to talk specifically about the differences between these 2 sets of nerves, right? The main difference between your cranial nerves versus your spinal nerves, can anyone tell me, in terms of information?
The difference between
The cranial nerves versus your spinal nerves, what types of information? This is a hard one.
Like sensory motor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sensory motor, right? Yeah. So which one's sensory?
Spine.
No,
That's
it's
motor.
because
That's
it makes
motor.
when you step
Oh,
on tap,
right.
it makes you retract.
Yep,
your muscles.
that's motor, right? So your cranial nerves are sensory information that's going into your brain. Okay, cranial nerves, sensory information into the brain.
Doesn't your spine have sensory neurons too? Because like, how else does it get like the fast reaction? Because like the signal goes to the spine,
Through the cranial nerves.
so it doesn't go to the spine in the back.
Well, the motor neurons carry information out from the brain so that you can execute motor behavior.
Right, but I was talking about like reflexes.
Yeah, that's cranial.
Reflexes don't go to your
Well, the cranial nerves send information into your brain. The spinal nerves send it out to the rest of your body, whatever your brain is telling you to do. But it happens pretty quickly.
But I thought once you touch a hot stove, you have like an immediate reaction because there's an interneuron, like it doesn't even reach the brain before.
Well, yeah, but the spinal cord is part of your brain, right?
Oh, okay.
That's your central nervous system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I mean, everyone wants to think that this is just your brain, but the spinal cord is also part of your brain. But yes, that is correct. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail, okay? So generally speaking, the cranial nerves provide sensory information to the brain and also tell the motor neurons what to do. And this is the order of the cranial nerves here. On Old Olympus towering top, Finn and German viewed some hops. Now, what do I mean by hops? I don't know. Beer? Hops? What are hops? Bunnies? Beer, right?
No,
I always thought it was Venn hops because that made more sense to me because beer, and I like beer. Y'all know I like beer, so that's what I always thought. But it's viewed. Everyone says it's viewed, but you don't need to know this.
Wait, one more time. On Old Olympus towering top.
Finn and German viewed some hops.
Okay, like finish first.
Hops are the flowers also called, seed cones or something of the hop plant, camelus or something. They're used primarily as flavoring.
All right, I'm just gonna go into Kucher again. I don't want you to stop.
Yeah, they're used in beer.
Kucher.
But
Kucher.
Google search always helps.
Right. It's okay.
That was very important.
All right. So this is the cranial nerve mnemonic. You don't need to know this for the exam. But know that each one of these cranial nerves is very specific for a type of function. So the olfactory nerve is for smell, that makes sense. The optic nerve is for vision, right? How many of you guys have had this information? Right? Okay, good. So we don't need to go over any of that. It will not be on the exam, yes.
That was my
That
question.
will not be on the exam. Okay? It will not.
The functions of them
So
will
the
be
cranial
on
nerves aren't.
Will not. The cranial nerves will not be on your exam.
Oh,
I just want you to be aware of them.
they were understood.
Because we will talk about the cranial, we're going to talk about the optic nerve. We're going to talk about the glossopharyngeal nerve. We're going to talk about the nerves as a part of the class. I just want you to be aware that we have cranial nerves.
So we don't need to know, it won't be on the test at all, any cranial nerve information?
No. Well, vagus nerve. Vagus nerve will be on there. Vagus nerve will be on there because I talk about autolowy on the exam. There's a vagus nerve question on there. You must have seen the exam. You're nodding like you know.
acetylcholine.
Yes, that's correct. You can study it. Vagus nerve will be on the exam. Okay? So this is generally how the peripheral nervous, and we all know what comprises the peripheral nervous system, right?
Yeah.
What constitutes the peripheral nervous system?
Not including the spinal cord.
Right, so everything else.
Everything else.
But that's somatic and autonomic. Now what is autonomic? What comprises the autonomic nervous system?
The sympathetic and parasympathetic.
That is right. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic. That's what autonomic is. Okay? Sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we also have the other part of our peripheral nervous system. This is called the somatic motor division of our peripheral nervous system. That kind of makes sense. What do you think that's important for? Motor stuff. So if Jack wants to punch Maggie in the face, his somatic motor system is going to be responsible for that. Incidentally, he does that all the time. He slaps her around. It's really terrible. He gets lots of timeouts, right? But this is what the somatic motor division does. It controls skeletal muscles through a specific type of synapse called the neuromuscular junction. Do we remember? I mentioned this last time, the neuromuscular junction.
Mm-hmm.
Can anyone tell? I feel like one of you might know the answer to this. What is the neurotransmitter that gets released in the neuromuscular junction? Acetylcholine. The neuromuscular junction, NMJ, is the biggest synapse in our bodies. And it is how we understand how synapses function because it's so large, it was the easiest one to study. So that's how we know so much about it. Right? But the somatic motor division is really about the brain's control of skeletal muscles through the neuromuscular junction. We have the autonomic division. Now I'm going over this because I want you to understand this. We're going to talk a lot about stress and the cardiovascular system because I think it's really important for these mental health disorders that we talk about later on in the course. But I want you to understand that the autonomic division is made up of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems and that they are essentially antagonistic to each other. We remember that, right? Mm-hmm. That if one is activated, then the other one is inhibited. Yes?
I do this, sorry.
Oh, you do that? Okay. That's okay. I thought you had a question.
No.
Right, but does that make sense, right? So when we talk about the autonomic division, we're talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. Now, I have this figure here to show you that you have a somatic motor neuron, okay? So once again, your motor neuron is located in your spinal cord. You see that? That nice little, that neuron guy right there. This is still part of your brain, right? Spinal cord is still part of your central nervous system. And you have a motor neuron that sits here. And what happens is that it sends this very long axon out to skeletal muscle. Okay? Or some type of muscle fiber. Okay? And what happens in this process is that it releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine then binds to its receptor and causes the contraction of a muscle. Okay, this is how I'm able to do this, right? It's because acetylcholine is being released and then it binds to a receptor on a muscle fiber, okay? Now notice this only has one synapse. One synapse. Monosynaptic. Mono meaning what? One. Now, do you notice down here, so this is the autonomic motor neuron. So we have a motor neuron that is located in the spinal cord. And what happens is that this autonomic motor neuron will synapse onto an autonomic ganglion. Now, does anyone know what a ganglion is?
That's the big group.
Yeah, a group of nerve cells. It's just a big clump of cells. Right? And so this motor neuron will synapse onto this group of cells, right? And it'll send out a neurotransmitter. And then this group of cells sends another axon to target tissue, like your kidneys, your heart, another gland, right? But this is your autonomic motor neuron. Now, do you see that there are two synaptic connections being made here versus one for the somatic motor system? Now, what is this one called? If the first one's called mono, then this one must be called disynaptic. Two, right? Disynaptic, right? So this one here is a monosynaptic connection. This one is disynaptic, meaning it has two different synapses, okay? And there are distinct differences between these two. Okay, does that make sense? Yes, okay, moving on. I want you to remember this slide. This is very important for the exam. This is, just go ahead and, highlight that, circle it, take it to sleep with you tonight. I want you to know the difference between between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. And you guys generally know what the differences are, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, right. Sympathetic is for what?
Fight or flight.
Yeah. So if you see a mountain lion coming your way, what are you gonna do?
Run.
Run. Unless you're like super brave. Who would fight? Yeah, I
It's gonna
think.
outrun me. It's smarter to fight it.
You think so?
Oh yeah.
Is it
You're-
really?
As a human, you're better off fighting most things than trying to run. Like a bear is significantly faster than like a horse on foot.
But I
So-
heard you're supposed to like cower and like stay
Well,
still.
depending on this, but if you're talking about just between fight or flight, 90% of the time with most creatures, you have a better chance of fighting it than running away.
Is that really true?
Yeah. Oh, humans are not fast at all. You'll just die tired. You're better off like getting a stick or something. and
I
trying
think
that.
my best bet is to just know that I'm going to die.
Yeah.
Right?
If that's an option.
I'm just
talking
gonna.
about between fight and flight. Fight is usually the better option.
All right, so has that changed anyone's minds?
No.
Would they fight
Unfortunately.
knowing the statistic?
Now I just know I need to outrun him.
That works too.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I would say it's fight now. I doubt it because I'm not much of a fighter. But yeah, I mean, I would go with flight, right? But the point for the sympathetic, the point being for this slide is that the sympathetic is for fight or flight and the parasympathetic is for rest and digest, right? I talk about this story all the time. It's my favorite story about Maggie. But Maggie, someone unwittingly gave my child 4 Oreo cookies. She's never had that many Oreo cookies. I've never ever given her that many again because I'm not a dumbass.
So it was you.
It was not me.
But you said again.
I know. But this faculty member at TWU, when we first got here, gave her 4 Oreo cookies. I was appalled. Of course, I had to deal with the aftermath, right? She is wigging out. She is screaming, she's yelling, she's singing, she's dancing. She's a whirlwind, right? Not even joking. 3 minutes later, bam, she's out. Out. This is her. You see all the cookies on her face? That's Oreo. That's not mud. That is Oreo all over her face. She was like Cookie Monster style, right? But this is her resting and digesting. This is Maggie's parasympathetic nervous system in action. It's like, dude, I had 4 Oreo cookies. I've met my calorie consumption requirement for the day. I am out. And she seriously took a 30-minute nap. It was impressive, and I was like, maybe I should always try this Oreo, because she doesn't take naps, right?
I really want to know who gave her these cookies in the first place.
I will not tell you, because it was somebody over in biology. Anyone want to take a guess? Who?
Is it Sarah?
No. Any other guesses? Good for you. You wouldn't want to know. This person is not someone to mess with. So when she gave Maggie the 4 cookies, I said, okay. But what's really, I think, important to remember is that these two systems balance each other out. So, this is a really great example, actually, because Maggie's sympathetic nervous system was in overdrive. Like, she was a total spaz, right? And then, bam, parasympathetic kicked in. She was knocked out, right? The parasympathetic is important for restoring body function. Her body said, hey, man, I'm tired. Let's sleep. Her sympathetic was totally out of whack, and then parasympathetic stepped in and said, okay, let's just chill out. Let's rest and digest, right? The parasympathetic is mostly innervated by the vagus nerve. That's your 10th cranial nerve. Please remember that. Okay? The 10th cranial nerve is what controls most of your parasympathetic nerves.
So are you always either in one or the other, or are you?
Usually.
Okay,
one or
so
the
like
other.
predominantly you're in the parasympathetic state, and then occasionally you'll switch. Okay, that's what I thought. And then for a second, you just made it sound like there's like a third thing, and then parasympathetic's only when you're like out, like knocked out.
No.
I think they're kind of like synergistic.
Yeah, I think
Someone's
that's a better way to
always
say it.
doing
It's more synergistic. So,
Yeah.
like right now, like I'm hungry, so my parasympathetic nervous system is probably not activated because I'm not resting or digesting, but I'm also not freaked out either. So I think that there is a state in which they can. I don't want to say they coexist, but maybe there's more activity of one versus the other.
But you're always essentially in one or the other to some extent. Like there's not a third thing.
I think generally speaking, the dogma is that you're in one or the other.
Okay.
But synergistic, I don't know. I mean,
I'm pretty sure that, I don't know, I'm pretty sure that I heard that some of your body can be in one state or the other.
I mean, that's,
depending on how much.
we could debate this.
Yeah.
Well,
This
in
is a
the
debatable
crash
thing.
course video, like he talked about how they work together sometimes.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I think at this point, some of you guys are like a little anxious about the exam, right? Your sympathetic nervous system is activated. But also at the same time, maybe you just had a huge lunch. Maybe you're digesting some of that lunch. I don't know, it's possible.
Well, and the thing is, like, I guess a good example is sex. So, like, sympathetic is, like, during it, but the parasympathetic is responsible for the orgasm. So, like, they work together.
They work together. Why not? Actually, damn it, I'm so out of it. Yes, they work cooperatively to regulate autonomic.
Oh,
What are we debating? I am seriously having a problem here.
do you need that hug?
Huh? I think I might need the hug. Don't worry, I'll
Why
get
am I
one from
forgetting
Jack
when
and
you
Maggie.
need glasses?
They give awesome hugs. Yes, they work cooperatively. Yeah, I think I think under circumstances like when you're running from a mountain lion, that's when your sympathetic nervous system will be activated, and that shuts down your peripheral nervous system. But I think it's in those extreme cases, and I think that's mostly what we refer to when we talk about these two things being antagonistic. Does that make sense? Okay. But some of your autonomic reflexes don't need input from your brain, right? So urination, your brain doesn't need to tell you when to pee. Defecation, erection, these types of things, you don't need input from your brain. And these are two very interesting videos that you can watch. I think one's from Melissa McCarthy movie, and then the other is Will Ferrell with the cougars in Talladega Nights. So if you would like to watch that clip, I think it's an awesome clip, and I love it. I think there's always time for Will Ferrell, except in this class. I know. Okay. So how much do we know about the sympathetic nervous system? Or the autonomic nervous system is what I really want to say. I don't want you to remember any of this crap, okay? That's not what this is here to show you. What I want you to remember is that we have these axons coming from these autonomic ganglia, which would be inside the sympathetic chain. And what they do is they send information out to things like your adrenal gland, okay? Like your heart, like your lungs and your kidneys, and so on and so forth, okay? So all of these axons, these sympathetic axons, make connections with tissue, target tissue, organs in your brain, okay? Does that make sense? All right, good. That's all I want you to take from that. Now, if you notice here, this is what happens when either one of these systems is activated. So this is your sympathetic division. I'm sure you've heard this before. This is fairly common knowledge, right? But if your sympathetic nervous system is activated, what happens is just basic things like increasing the bronchial diameter, right? So bronchodilation, what is that? Yeah, you want more oxygen in your lungs. Why? You're freaking out, but for what other reason?
So you can make that.
To your muscles. Your muscles need that oxygen to run the hell away from that mountain lion, right? It also does stuff like it stimulates glucose production and release. Why would you need glucose? What is glucose?
Sugar.
Yeah, sugar. You want to release that sugar so that your muscles have the sugar it needs to fight. You're this brave guy over here to fight that
I'm not
mountain
brave,
lion.
I'm smart. You're not gonna outrun most
Okay.
predators. You're
Brave
it's
and
not a
smart.
brave
Brave
thing,
and
it's-
smart. I still think it's pretty brave that
It's
you're gonna
not.
fight. It's way braver than I would be. I think we can vote on this. How many think it's pretty brave to fight a mountain lion? Oh, this is already. I think it's pretty brave. I don't
You're
know.
just not
Maybe
gonna
I'm-
outrun it. That's the only reason.
I believe you. I believe you.
I think the true test would be like if you actually had to face down a mountain lion.
I'm not saying I'd win. I just know I'd lose if I ran. That's what I'm saying.
I could see like telling myself I'm gonna fight it and then be like, oh shit, no, and then just,
Right.
like, there's another.
I think I'm just gonna play dead.
Yeah, that's
Maybe
my
that's what
answer.
you're supposed to do.
I've heard both.
I don't know. I don't know anything
Cry a
about
lot in front of the bear just be like,
Oh,
"Hey, bear,"
jeez.
and they
Leaves you alone at a
Yes,
table.
exactly.
That's
It's
what we're
very
hoping
pity
for,
on you.
right?
I want you to know that if you don't do well on this exam, crying is not gonna work on me. I am not
I
a
don't know
bear.
that.
Not a bear.
So should we run or pretend to be dead?
The dead option is better. Your dead option is better. All right, but you stimulate glucose production and release. What are you also doing? You're also stimulating the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, what are those two hormones important for?
Fight or flight.
Adrenaline, fight or flight, yeah. This is your adrenaline response, right? Epinephrine is adrenaline to the brain. Okay, that's adrenaline. That's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. It's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase your blood pressure. It's going to help you run or fight or do whatever you decide to do in the face of a mountain lion, right?
Is that why after you had a lot of adrenaline, the parasympathetic, kicks in and you kind of
Because
experience
you
that
gotta
low?
calm down,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
So at the same time that the other things are kicking into hyperdrive, do other functions like how like right now I'm chilling and I'm digesting my delicious lunch, but like if we had to run out of here, would I stop? Like
You will no
slow
longer
down?
be hungry.
Like slow down.
I think it kind of depends on how imminent the danger is.
Okay.
So if it's just like me coming after you, you're gonna be like, whatever, right? Because I'm not really gonna hurt you. Can't. That's a lawsuit. But if I had a mountain lion up here
Yeah.
coming after you, yeah, you're sure as hell that parasympathetic nervous system is gonna shut down real fast,
Okay.
and the sympathetic is gonna kick in,
And
and
you
that's
could-
when it becomes antagonistic.
You're-
That's when you have inhibition of one system versus the other. When it's a life-threatening type of situation.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
And when it shuts off and it like the sympathetic nervous system fires up significantly enough, like to that degree, you stop digesting. You don't feel.
Oh
hungry.
yeah, because you
Like,
can't use those resources for digestion, right?
really cool.
You got to use them for your muscles. You got to use them for increasing the oxygen in your lungs. You have to dedicate all those resources to making sure you preserve your life, which I'm sure is very valuable to all of you, right? Yes. Okay. And then you have on the other side of the coin, and I want you to remember these differences. This is an essay question on your exam. Oh my God, look how nice I am. I don't usually do that. I don't know what's gotten into me. It must be my mid to late life crisis, right? So this is the parasympathetic nervous system, right? And what happens in this situation is that, you're parasympathetic, you're constricting your airways. Why? Why would you constrict your airways? Yeah, and you don't need oxygen to digest food. It just happens. You could just lie on this table and digest food, right? That would be fine. I would love to do that right now because I had a huge lunch. But also, what else does it do? It stimulates digestion, right? So it actually causes stimulation of those digestive juices. That's gross. I didn't mean to say it like that. That grosses me out. But the acids in your stomach, right? So it stimulates the acids in your stomach so that you can digest all of your food. Okay? What else does it do? Well, it slows down your heart rate. Your sympathetic nervous system accelerates your heart rate. Your parasympathetic slows your heart rate. Now, why would it be advantageous to increase your heart rate in the sympathetic nervous system? Yes, let's pump blood faster because those muscles need that blood more than anything else, right? It also causes the release of insulin. Why would insulin be important?
To help monitor your blood sugar.
Yeah, to store that glucose that you're going to need later to fight the mountain lion, right?
The parasympathetic.
No, the insulin is important to help you store the glucose, so that you can use that glucose is a reserve for later.
The insulin is related to the parasympathetic.
Okay, sorry, I didn't understand that question. Yes, but it's to store that glucose that you're going to need later. Okay, does all that stuff make sense? Okay, so these are, in essence, I guess, antagonistic in the way that they function, right? Because you have that increasing of the airways versus constricting of the airways, accelerating the heart rate versus slowing it down, so on and so forth. You store glucose here, you stimulate glucose here, right? Antagonistic in that way. Okay, just remember that. But this is also a nice little thing so that you know exactly what happens for each one of the systems. I guess the sympathetic nervous.
So memorize that.
If you want. It's not necessary. I think it's actually more important to memorize this here. I think this makes a lot more sense. Okay. Now, we have, I always talk about this, and then as soon as I do, I regret it after. It's like, you shouldn't have had that 5th White Russian, but you do it anyway, right? Like, you guys are all nodding, like, yeah, that happened to me last night, right? So, but I want to show you this, because remember, the somatic motor division is what? Monosynaptic, right? One synapse. The autonomic pathway has 2 synapses, and we talked about this earlier, right? So you have your preganglionic neuron. This is the neuron that exists in your spinal cord. And then this synapses onto an autonomic ganglion. And then this is what synapses onto a target tissue, like your heart or your lungs or what have you, right? Okay, so this, in essence, makes sense. This is when it gets confusing. I know. This is when I regret it. This is my 5th White Russian. Okay. So, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic, and one of your videos talked about this, that spazzy guy. You guys know which guy I'm talking about?
The crash course?
Yeah, the crash course guy. He talked about this, I think. But he talked about the differences between the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic pathways. Now, when they make that first synapse, right, they both use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. Actually, I guess in this situation, yes, neurotransmitter. And then for your sympathetic pathway, it releases norepinephrine onto the target tissue. But the parasympathetic pathway releases acetylcholine. They're different. They're different. And when acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor, this nicotinic receptor is actually a ligand-gated ion channel. When it binds to a muscarinic receptor, this is a G protein coupled receptor, right? So it has very different effects here than it does up here. Yes?
So is that why cigarettes, maybe this is word association gets nicotinic, but is that, so nicotine binds to nicotinic receptors?
That's exactly why it was named nicotinic.
Okay.
Because nicotine will bind to it.
Oh.
That's,
So,
yeah, and muscarine, which is another chemical, binds to muscarinic receptors.
Should you like have that fight or flight when you smoke a cigarette?
no, it's the other way around. You smoke cigarettes and it causes the parasympathetic pathway to activate. Right?
I mean, the nicotinic receptors for both,
Okay.
right? But in terms of the nicotine, I think it affects your central nervous system probably more than it does here.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's supposed to improve learning and memory too.
Smoking?
Don't smoke. Yeah. But actually, no, I'm serious. It improves learning and memory.
Smoking does.
Right.
So, but,
Do you want to go smoke something now and you can remember it later?
well, I just always thought there was like no benefit in smoking. I've never heard of
No,
that.
nicotine.
Oh, okay.
Nicotine, which is found in cigarettes.
Oh, okay.
So nicotine actually improves learning and memory. But that is not to say that I want you to go out and smoke. I'm not a walking
Still make the
advertisement
crumbs
for like
up
Marlboro,
Smart people don't feel
or
like they
Camel,
can
or any of the other cigarettes out there.
Nicotine patches.
Nicotine patches. There you go, all over your face. That's right. That's
Study.
All right, but this is a table outlining which neurotransmitters are important for which synapses. So for your somatic motor division, acetylcholine is the one that's important. And acetylcholine will bind to a nicotinic receptor and cause your muscles to contract. So that's Jack going, hey! I tell you guys about that? I haven't told you that. It's my favorite story. I'm trying to teach the kids how to go, hi-ya! Right, and Maggie's really good at it. She's really good at kicking because her balance is pretty good. But Jack, his balance on one foot's not so good, so he's like, ha! And his foot comes down real hard. He's like, ha! And you can only do it with one foot, and it's like so cute. And eventually I'm going to take a video of it because I think it's so adorable. Okay? But that's what the nicotinic receptor is doing. It causes your muscles to contract. Now the muscarinic is far more complicated. Do you guys remember that Otto Lowy story that I told you about him stimulating the vagus nerve? Acetylcholine's being released, it slows down the heart rate. That's because it binds to a muscarinic receptor. Now do you see how that happens? Acetylcholine, when it binds to a nicotinic receptor, causes a muscle to contract. It causes this to depolarize. But when it binds to a muscarinic receptor, it actually causes the heart rate to slow down. Not interesting?
Why is that?
Because they're just two different receptors with two different effects. This is the muscarinic is a G protein coupled receptor, the nicotinic is a ligand-gated ion channel. Or sodium. Doesn't that just blow your mind? That's cool. But that's a really great example of how one neurotransmitter can bind to two different receptors and have two very different effects. Yeah, that's deep, right? Yeah. That's what I think. Deep, super deep. Okay? Understood?
Wait, so what do we have to know from that?
Know that that acetylcholine is being released by your parasympathetic versus norepinephrine for your sympathetic. Okay?
In
What
the
about that
second synapse.
Yeah, from the second synapse. The common one is acetylcholine for that first synapse, but the second one is different. Yeah.
What about the chart?
Well, this chart will help you to remember this. So yeah, you can memorize either or. Okay? See some scared faces again. Anyone need a hug? Okay, no. Okay. Hugs, not drugs. Which means do not smoke a cigarette after this class. If I catch anyone smoking a cigarette, I'm gonna slap it out of your hand. Don't start now. Okay? But this is the difference between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, and you don't need to know this for the exam. A sigh of relief. But once again, sensory information enters into the brain, motor information leaves the brain. Okay? Afferent going up, efferent going out. Do we know that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. So, neuroanatomy. Do we know all of this?
Yes.
All right. Anyone not know this? Anyone afraid to admit that they don't know this? Okay. Anterior, front, posterior, back. Okay. That's also referred to as rostral caudal. Dorsal is top, ventral is bottom. Dorsal, ventral. Okay. Anterior, posterior, rostral, caudal, dorsal, ventral. Do a little dance. Stephanie.
Do we need to know, because you're saying like rostral and caudal, when you take either one?
Yeah. I'll take either or. Yeah. Medial is the middle part of your brain. Anything that goes away from medial is called lateral. Okay? Know this.
Well, we need to know, like, how those directional things change for the spinal cord.
No.
No. Okay.
But I do want you to know them for the brain because we'll talk about them during the rest of this class. So know this. I don't remember if there's a question about this on the exam. I don't think that there is. But this is just a demonstration of it. We won't go over it. You don't need to know that, so I won't talk about it. I know, meninges. What? Meninges are important. They protect your brain. Whatever.
So we don't know meninges?
Meninges.
Okay.
No, you don't need to know it. I'm going to skip it. I want you to know about the cerebral, circumventricular, the ventricles. Just the ventricles of the brain, right? So, sorry, I'm just having a real hard time. I didn't have enough coffee today. I think that's my problem. So you have, just what's important? So what is in the ventricles?
CSF.
CSF, yeah. Cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. Now, what is CSF important for?
Nutrients and waste.
It clears out waste products, but it's also really great because it helps cushion your brain. It's a nice little cushion for your brain. So, if I hit my head up against the wall, that means that my brain's not going to smack up against my skull, right? Because the cushion of the CSF is going to keep my brain floating. My brain floats in CSF. That is awesome. It's like a pool of CSF for my brain. Also, CSF is important because the brain, so the brain floats in it, which also means what in terms of the weight of the brain?
Buoyant.
It's buoyant. It just sits there and it floats and it feels lighter than it should because it's floating in that CSF. Because technically the brain weighs 3 pounds. Now, can anyone tell me how much 3 pounds is in terms of kilograms? Like, anyone know? I think it's like 6.6 kilograms. I think it's like 2.2 kilograms per pound or something.
1.36078.
Is that right?
I just googled it.
I guess.
Oh.
Google has spoken.
Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm going the wrong way. Yeah. It's 2.2 pounds per kilogram. Yes, that's what I meant to say. Yeah. So it's 1. What did you say? 1.3?
1.36.
36. Okay. So, kilograms, right? That's 1,000 grams. But when the brain is suspended in CSF, it actually only weighs 80 grams. That's a lot less light. That's a lot lighter, right, than 1,000 grams. That's pretty amazing, right? So the brain becomes much, much lighter because of the CSF. Now, we have a flow. There's a flow to the CSF. So it flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. Don't pay attention to this term here, but it flows from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. So the cerebral aqueduct is here. This is kind of close to where the midbrain is. And then the fourth ventricle is where your hindbrain is, right? But your lateral and your third ventricles are the front part of your brain, okay? But the basic flow is from the lateral ventricle to the third cerebral aqueduct and then to the fourth, okay? So that's the flow of your CSF. That's how it flows through the ventricular system, okay? Now the ventricles are all interconnected. And you have a structure known as the choroid plexus. You guys see that pink mass there? This choroid plexus is what makes your CSF. And it makes it at a constant rate. In fact, it produces 500 mils of CSF a day. That's insane. That's a Nalgene bottle. That's how much CSF you're producing every single day. Okay. Do you guys know what hydrocephalus is?
Isn't that when
You
you
like too much.
Yeah, you're making too much.
Quench the cell.
I'll get all that pressure. Do you know how they relieve that?
they have to drain it?
Yeah.
Yeah, they drill a hole in your skull, right? And then they shut all that stuff into your abs. And then you pee it out. Crazy, right?
They do what?
Yeah, I know, right?
No, I didn't hear
No,
what
I
you said.
swear to God. So they stick like something they stick a hole in your brain and then they shunt all that extra CSF into your gut so that you pee it out.
Why don't they just take it out? Yeah.
Because it's constantly being manufactured. It doesn't
Oh,
just
so it's like a permanent thing.
yeah, it's a permanent
Oh,
thing.
I thought.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
even
yeah,
more
your
interesting.
body. I know.
So you just have like a wire.
Not a
like
wire,
tube,
but like a
tube.
catheter. Like a catheter, yeah. And then you
Jeez.
stick it into your stomach and you pee out CSF all day. Crazy, right? Crazy. I know. Neuroscientists are crazy. Neurosurgeons are nuts. All right. This is for the rest of the class. You don't need to memorize this for your exam, but this is for the rest of the class. Okay. Just in general, your forebrain is really important for the higher cognitive processes of your brain, right? So what am I going to wear today? What will my future career look like, right? This is all dictated by your forebrain, specifically the cerebral cortex, right? So higher executive function is really the cerebral cortex's job. And then you have the basal ganglia. This is important for motor learning, right? So if I want to learn how to throw a ball, this is what the basal ganglia is important for. You probably already know all this stuff, right? The limbic system is important for emotion, memory, and motivation. The thalamus is your sensory relay center. So almost all of your sensory systems go through the thalamus before it goes to the cortex, right? We're going to talk a lot about that. The hypothalamus, that's important for all your homeostatic systems. What do I mean by homeostatic system? What is a homeostatic system? Eating, drinking, temperature regulation, all that good stuff, right? That's the hypothalamus's job, is to make sure that those things are properly regulated. You have your midbrain, right? Tectum, tegmentum. This is important for visual, auditory information, homeostatic, reflexive information for the tegmentum. The cerebellum, we all know what cerebellum is, right? That's a little part of your brain. Maggie knows what that is. What? Yeah, also a little brain. It's called little brain. I think it's Latin for little brain, right? But it's also important for motor coordination, balance, things like that. Pons, important for sleep, respiration, medulla oblongata, heart, lungs. Any damage to your hindbrain does what? Kills you. You are dead. But weirdly enough, if you cut in between, like the hindbrain and the midbrain, you can keep that person alive. They've done this in, I think, cats, also rats. But isn't that amazing? That if you just severed the connection between the midbrain and the hindbrain, you can keep that animal alive. You just have to feed it, make sure it gets adequate water, and then you make sure it's, in a well temperature controlled environment, and you keep that thing alive. That's crazy, right?
So that would be considered a vegetable, but still alive?
Yes, like a coma.
People do that.
They used to.
Why?
To figure out how things worked. But they did it in animals. They didn't do it in humans. I know. We did horrible stuff back in the 60s. They didn't know any
The
better.
60s, Jesus.
Well, they had to know how these things
I thought it
work.
was earlier.
Yeah, no.
Did you want us to
Well,
know
I
all of those functions specific to parts for the exam?
No. I just want you to be aware of them for the rest of the class, yes.
What about like labeling the brain, like the parts of the brain that
Yep,
are on
that's
the...
what I'm going to get to right now.
Oh, okay.
So, I want you to know what all the lobes are. Be able to identify, be able to name all your different lobes. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Know what those things are. Not what those things are, where those things are. I'm going to give you an image that looks exactly like this. It may not be colored, right? So I think I'm going to print in black and white. But you're going to have to label that this is frontal lobe, this is parietal, this is occipital, this is temporal. Yes?
So, I know that speech communication comes in two parts. It's like the frontal lobe part and there's like a temporal lobe part. So like, there was in our lab today, I'm in human biology because I'm missing a science credit, but it kind of goes along with in this class and some of the things, like what we're going over right now. So like, one of the questions was the temporal lobe. Well, I answered temporal lobe, but is that right? That like, if you, like, let's say if you suddenly couldn't talk, but you can think it, is that your temporal lobe?
That was the Broca's area.
Yeah, Broca, Wernicke's
Yeah, I knew about those, but
Yeah.
I thought those were in your frontal lobe, or like, not frontal lobe, but like up here. I
Yeah.
didn't know they were on the side.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, moving on. So I want you to know what this is. Homunculus. You guys know you know what the homunculus is, right? Okay, yeah, that thing. So what's really cool is that each part of and this is a really fundamental part of understanding neuroscience, but each part of your brain is important for a different area of your body, right? So this is your somatosensory strip here. So this part of your cortex, right, as highlighted here in brown, this part of your cortex is important for the control of your tongue. This part is not control of your tongue, but like when you sense things on your tongue, right? Like I know I'm touching my tongue right now because that part of my cortex is responding to that touch, right? Now over here you have something called the motor strip. And these two things, the somatosensory and the motor strip, are separated by your central sulcus, right? And so, for example, if I'm touching my hand, or if I want to move my hand, my motor strip at this part of the cortex here is what's controlling that hand movement. Does that make sense? But every single part of your body has a different representation on your cortex. But the reason why I want to show you this is to show you how well organized your cortex is. That every single part of your cortex is specifically designed for a certain part of your body. And that to me is really amazing. Now, if you see how large the representation is for your hands, a huge part of your cortex is dedicated to the functioning of your hands, because this is probably the most important thing on your body, right?
It's one of the most delicate and intricate.
Yeah, and this fine motor movement here, right? Not a whole lot of fine motor movement happening with your tongue, your toes, right? But definitely, I know, right? Well, Maggie does this a lot. But you know what I mean? So there's a lot of cortex dedicated to the hand for that reason. So this is what's called a homunculus. And the reason why we know about the homunculus is because of this guy, Wilder Penfield, who was trying to help epileptic seizure patients, right? He was trying to figure out where these seizures were happening. And so he would stimulate different parts. And you know, patients can be awake during this, because this doesn't cause any pain. There's no pain sensors up here, right? So he was able to stimulate different parts of the cortex. And he found out, hey, this part is important for stimulating hand movement. This part is important for stimulating a sensation on the tongue. That's how he was able to isolate the different functions of the cortex. It's really, really cool. This will be on your exam, phantom limb syndrome. You guys know what this is, right? This is amazing. This is amazing stuff, because this basically tells us that the brain is highly plastic, that our brain can adapt to a lot of different situations, right? So the phantom limb, you know, you get the sensation from a missing limb. It's usually in the form of some type of pain. But cortical representation of a now missing limb is invaded by adjacent brain regions, right? So the man who could still feel his leg even though it wasn't there anymore, and the man who mistook his foot for a penis. You guys hear about this? Mm-hmm. So he would feel orgasms in his feet.
Whoa.
Yeah,
That's
right?
hardcore.
What? Yeah, right? Just all of a sudden, orgasm in my foot. Crazy, right? But that's phantom limb syndrome, because your cortical maps, they call these cortical maps, can change, right? They can adapt to different circumstances, like losing a leg, losing a foot, losing your member, you know? And it's all because if you look at this here, you look at your somatosensory cortex here, do you see how your feet are really close to your genitals? Yeah. Right, so the what you have happening here is that because his this poor guy's genitals were gone, right, it started encroaching on this area over here with his feet. So that's why he could start feeling orgasms in his feet. Isn't that crazy? It's nuts. It's nuts. That's how insane the brain is, right? All right, so I'm trying to figure out if you need to know anything from here for the exam. No, I don't think you do. So you can ignore these. We're going to come back to corpus callosum. Do you guys know what corpus callosum is?
That's what connects the two.
That's what connects. That will be on the exam. This is what connects the two hemispheres. Please remember corpus callosum. Okay? Just corpus callosum from here. Remember the ventricles, how the CSF flows. And I think that's it for here. Yep.
What about the midside of the brain?
Where was that here? No. No, you don't need to know that. No. This is in general what I want you to know for the course. So we'll come back to that because I think we're out of time. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So study a lot. Yes.
Did you say that there was something else we needed to know after the corpus callosum?
No. No, that's it.
The ventricle.
Yeah, the ventricles. But I already told you that before. All right. So if you have any questions, email me. I will answer them. Your exam is on Tuesday. You can bring that